You wouldn't think twice about not giving your kid a Budweiser, but you don't think twice about giving your kid a can of Coke.
You eat these foods, your beta cells send the alarm bells off.
Fruit is evil.
Do you know what makes you sick and overweight? It's not fat. The answer is sugar.
Hello everyone, I'm Tony from Architect Fitness, and in this video we are going to be talking about sugar. Is it bad for you? Should you be avoiding it? And is it more addictive than cocaine? Let's jump right into it. First of all, if you've been paying attention to the health and fitness world for even about a year, you will see so many trends come and go where people blame one single factor for all of America's health problems and obesity. And right now, the hot button is sugar. Interestingly though, we can already see this starting to get phased out in place of meat as propaganda pieces like the Game Changers seem to be gaining a lot of traction. So it won't be long before sugar is not even talked about anymore and meat is the culprit for all of our health and fitness issues. But what is the truth? Is there science to back up that sugar is really that bad for us? Are we really addicted to sugar? Are you addicted to sugar? That's what I want to talk about today. First, we need to define what it is we're actually talking about. Sugar has a few different forms, but the most common are sucrose, fructose, and glucose. Now, it doesn't matter what type of form of sugar you're talking about, all sugars fall under the umbrella of carbohydrates. That's why when you look at a food's nutrition label, you will see the amount of sugar in that food listed under the number of carbohydrates. So for example, if a food has 40 grams of carbs in a serving, and let's say 15 of those grams come from sugars, that doesn't mean that there's a total of 55 grams of carbs. That means 15 out of those 40 grams come from sugar. So when it comes to counting macros, which a lot of you watching do, the sugar just goes towards your carbohydrate count because as far as your body's concerned, from an energy perspective, they are the same. Now we're going to talk about something that a lot of people don't seem to know, which is that sugar is actually essential for human life, more specifically glucose. And if you don't eat any sugar or carbohydrates, your body will actually make its own glucose by taking proteins either from the food that you've eaten or proteins stored in your muscles and turn those proteins into glucose because your brain actually lives off of glucose. And glucose is also really important as a stored form of energy in your muscles known as glycogen. And we use glycogen when we exercise, and it's literal fuel for our muscles. It's also really important to know that every carbohydrate that you eat will get broken down into a sugar in your body. So there is always going to be sugar and glucose present in your body no matter what, even if you eat a no sugar diet. Now this brings us to a very obvious question, which is, Tony, if we don't need to eat any sugar to get glucose, if we can make our own glucose, isn't that a great argument for not eating any sugar? And my answer to that question would be no, that is not a good argument. And I will explain to you why in two different parts. First of all, if we think about nutrition from an evolutionary perspective, why we have our bodies have developed to have these different systems, think about what we would eat prior to modern day agriculture. When we were a species that hunted and gathered, we would eat plants, so fruits and vegetables, and we would eat animal meats and possibly some seafood as well. It's much easier to gather plants and eat those than it is to hunt and fish, because hunting and fishing requires a lot more energy expenditure. You have to track the food, you have to track the animals. So hunting came with a whole host of dangers and challenges that would make us think that it makes sense that we would eat a fairly carbohydrate and sugar-rich diet from these carbs that we're getting from plants and things like fruits and berries, maybe potatoes or corn, wild corn. So why then do we have this process where we can make our own glucose from proteins? Well, if you live in a climate like New England, there's not a lot of natural vegetation during the winter months. And so during these months, if you were a person that lived in this area, you would probably eat a lot of animal meats during those winter months to get by. And animals don't typically have a lot of carbohydrate content in their meat, so we would go long periods of time without having any carbohydrate intake. So it makes sense that we would have this kind of evolutionary fail-safe that was a way for our body to get glucose without actually eating any. And it's funny because glucose is a mandatory thing for your body to have, basically, but we don't consider it an essential nutrient, because essential nutrients are defined by things that your body needs to survive but cannot make on its own. So because we have this gluconeogenesis process in the liver, glucose is not considered essential, but that doesn't mean it's not important. So what are some examples of essential nutrients? Well, a really popular one that you're probably already familiar with is essential fatty acids, like omega-3 fatty acids. That is a nutrient that your body has to have to survive, but you cannot make your own. You have to acquire it through your food. And another essential nutrient are essential amino acids, and these are found in proteins. And again, they're very important for your body, and your body cannot make its own. The human body can actually take different amino acids from different food sources and combine them to get an essential amino acid profile. There's a few different amino acids that we need. But there is one food source that contains a complete amino acid profile, and that is animal meat. So we don't have to eat a wide variety of foods to get all of our essential amino acids if we're eating animal meats. So it doesn't really make sense that our body would want to have to give up those very hard to acquire and complete proteins to give us glucose when we could just get glucose from our diet. So while it is possible to survive with this gluconeogenesis process in our liver, I don't think our bodies have really evolved for that to be the primary source of our glucose. So you might hear all of that and think, well, that's great, but how important is sugar specifically? Because maybe we're supposed to take carbs and then break them down into sugars in our body. How much sugar did we eat when we were hunter-gatherers? Another thing that a lot of people always point out is that fruit has been specifically bred in a way that makes it more sweet and has somewhat increased the sugar content of fruit. If you or I were walking around in the woods a few thousand years ago, we probably wouldn't recognize many of the fruits in their natural pre-inbred states. But there were some really common forms of sugar in nature. A big one is honey, pure honey. Hunter-gatherers would eat a lot of honey. There's a modern-day hunter-gatherer tribe known as the HADZA. They're a tribe of people that just have been isolated and have not really been affected by the westernized world, if you will. And their diet consists a lot of a fruit called the baobab fruit. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And that fruit is a mixture of carbohydrates and pure sugars. And there's a big period of time throughout the year where that's like 90% of their diets. Now let's think about a food like a potato, which has been eaten by so many different cultures for so long across the globe. And potatoes need to be cooked. As a species, humans have been cooking for about 2 million years. And so we've been cooking potatoes because a lot of times some potatoes are actually poisonous if they're not cooked. Same thing with yucca, which is like a type of potato almost. And when you start to cook these starches, the carbohydrates in them break down and they start the process of becoming sugar. And that process is continued when we start to chew and throughout the whole digestion process. But the point is, we've been eating large amounts of carbohydrates and sugar for quite a long time. So this isn't necessarily anything new to our bodies. And the next point that everyone always loves to bring up is, okay, well, what about processed sugars or added sugars? Those must be the culprit, right? Let's see what the science says about that. In 1997, there was a study done, and this is actually quite brilliant. The researchers took 42 women and they split them into two groups. One group was going to be on a high sugar diet and one group was going to be in a low sugar diet. And both groups were eating about 1,100 calories a day. In the high sugar group, they were eating around 85 grams of sucrose per day. Now, sucrose is the type of sugar that most people think of when they think of processed or added sugars. The low sugar group was eating right around 7 to 8 grams of sucrose per day. They did this for 6 weeks, and at the end of the study, they found Both groups lost the same amount of weight. Both groups improved their blood pressure. Both groups reported better improved moods and less irritability. Both groups had reduced their urinary norepinephrine. That's essentially a marker of how hard their adrenal glands are working. The only difference between the two groups was that the low sugar group had slightly better cholesterol readings. And the prevailing theory or guess behind why that is because the lower sugar group was eating more fibrous carbohydrate, and so the additional fiber probably accounted for the discrepancy in cholesterol. But what that showed us was that both groups had very similar outcomes because they were on a calorie restricted diet. They both lost weight, they both felt better. So when we are equating calories, that is the most important thing. The calorie deficit is the most important thing, especially if your goal is weight loss. It doesn't necessarily matter how you're getting your foods, where they're coming from. If you are restricting your calories and putting your body into a calorie deficit, you are going to lose weight. You are going to improve your health markers. Because remember, they measured not just weight, but they measured their blood pressure and they measured their mood and all these things. So you can include sugar into a healthy diet. Now, let's move on to the real hot topic of this whole video, which is sugar addictive? And you've probably seen the claim that sugar has been rated to be 8 times more addictive than cocaine. So where did this claim come from? Well, there is a somewhat famous study that involved laboratory rats, and essentially the researchers let the rats choose between sugar-sweetened water and cocaine. And what they found is that the rats chose the sugar-sweetened water on average 8 times more frequently than they did the cocaine. While I think this is an interesting study, and while I do think animal studies can be a great starting point for a lot of science, this hardly is a definitive way to say that sugar is more addictive than cocaine. First of all, I have a problem with the language. We wouldn't say that we're addicted to oxygen or that we're addicted to water because we recognize that our body needs those things to survive. Well, we also know that we need glucose. So is it really fair to say that glucose is addictive or sugar is addictive? No, it's a nutrient that helps us survive. If you were addicted to cocaine or heroin or alcohol, you could go the rest of your life without ever using those substances. The same cannot be said for sugar. You could not have sugar for the rest of your life, or if you found a way to somehow stop gluconeogenesis from happening, you could not survive. You literally need glucose to survive. So I don't think it's really fair to say that sugar is addictive. And the other thing we need to consider is that no one should really be surprised that an animal chose a substance which had 2 very important nutrients in it, that being sugar and water, over a drug. So in my opinion, this study doesn't really prove anything about the addictive nature of sugar. Now, you are probably sitting there thinking, but I know I'm addicted to sugar. I personally struggle with sugar addiction. And there's a lot of research that's going into this right now. And one of the most prominent researchers on food addiction is Dr. Nicole Avena. And she did a study with Yale students where she essentially took 120 students and asked them to rank different foods on how hard it would be to limit their eating of those foods if the foods were presented to them. And basically what she found were some of the most addictive foods were things like pizza, potato chips, cookies, chocolate, and I don't think anyone is going to disagree with her about those foods being very hard to stop eating. And some of the foods that she found were not addictive were things like beans without any other sauce or toppings, cucumbers, and carrots. Now let's think about this for a second. Is it really the sugar in these foods that's making them addictive? Well, pizza doesn't really have any sugar in it. I've seen some people claim that the sugar in the tomato sauce on the pizza is enough to make it addictive. And I looked up how much sugar is in tomato sauce. It depends on the sauce, but some sauces were as high as 10 grams of sugar per cup. So if you talk about per slice, there's only 1 or 2 grams of sugar per slice. In fact, I found on Domino's website, even on a 16-inch extra large pizza, a single slice only had 1 to maybe 3 grams of sugar, depending on the sauce you put on it. Of course, things like buffalo sauce make that sugar rating a little bit higher, towards that 3 gram per slice mark. But the other thing you have to consider is something like the glycemic index gets thrown out the window as soon as you start eating mixed foods. So something like the cheese and the fats from the oils of the pizza are going to slow down that digestion and change the glycemic response of the sugar in the tomato sauce. What about potato chips? Another highly addictive food, people claim. Well, there's basically no sugar in potato chips. Yeah, but what about cookies and pastries and all that stuff? Sure, they all have sugar in them. What else do they have in them? That's right, fats. If you look at all the hyper palatable foods, they are almost all universally a combination of carbs and fats. So is it really fair to say that the sugar is what's making these foods addictive? Think about all of the really delicious foods where if we remove the fat from them, they kind of become disgusting. No one's out here craving dry pieces of bread. Bread becomes delicious when you put butter on it. What about pasta? Again, it becomes delicious when you put butter on it, or another very fatty sauce like Alfredo sauce. No one's eating dry cooked pasta. Even something like a salad, which is primarily carbohydrate, becomes more palatable when you put a fatty, oil-based dressing on top of it. It's the combination of carbs and fats that makes foods hyper-palatable. So it's not fair to say that sugar is what's making these foods addictive. So why are foods that combine carbs and fats so palatable? Well, carbs and fats are 2 nutrients that your body really needs. And so to your brain, the way it's evolved, when you eat these foods, your brain goes, hey, you just hit the jackpot. This food has got everything we need in it. Keep eating it. And it's a combination that doesn't really exist in nature that frequently. So to your brain, it's even more novel. But really ask yourself, are there any foods that are pure carbs or sugar that you just find extremely craveable? Most people aren't out there just spooning table sugar out of a bag or drinking pure maple syrup or pure honey. Those are pure sugar sources. If you were really addicted to sugar, you would be craving those things. But even most candies, like chocolate-based candies, have a lot of carbs and a lot of fats in them. It's always that combination that makes food hyper-palatable. So hopefully I've convinced you that sugar is not the white devil that people make it out to be. But that doesn't mean certain foods won't trigger you to overeat. And that's really what it's all about. Of course, you could eat nothing but Twinkies and eat in a calorie deficit and lose weight and maybe potentially improve some of your other health markers. However, doing that would be very difficult because processed foods don't really fill you up, and some foods can trigger you to overeat. So it makes it harder to be in a calorie deficit. So what do we do for those foods? Of course, the number one thing you can do is food reduction or avoidance. Now, I don't really encourage complete avoidance because people have what's called ego fatigue. We literally have a limit to how often we can say no to things. And these foods are going to be present throughout our day-to-day life. That's just kind of how it is with the modern food environment. So you're going to go to the office and there's going to be donuts there, or there's going to be cupcakes, or you're going to go out with friends and people are going to be ordering dessert. So just saying no isn't always a great strategy because eventually you're going to buckle, and when you buckle, you don't want to go overboard. So while you can try to avoid these foods, that's not the best or only strategy I recommend employing. Eating a high protein diet is another great strategy, and that's because protein has been shown to be more satisfying and help people feel fuller for a longer period of time. Another thing you can do is drink an adequate amount of water, particularly before a big meal. So if you know that you're going to be going out to dinner where there's going to be a lot of tempting foods, drinking an increased amount of water might help to satisfy you and make you feel fuller and keep you from having those cravings. Another really important strategy that you can use is increase your fiber intake. I recommend a minimum of 20 grams per day for women and 25 grams per day for men, but you really have to get up to 40, 50, 60 grams a day before you're eating too much fiber. So increasing your fiber take can go a long way. Just like eating more protein, eating more fiber can help you feel more satisfied, feel fuller, and of course, fiber also helps to regulate blood sugar, which a lot of people point to as the culprit for having sweet cravings. In order to be successful in health and fitness, you have to have the right knowledge and the right strategy. It's hard to have the right strategy if you're working off the wrong information. That's why I get so worked up when people say that they're addicted to sugar or people blame sugar for everything. The truth is, you can include sugar in your diet and still get results if you are paying attention to the other very important factors in nutrition. And I want you to remember this and think about this the next time the next hot button issue comes up, the next time the mainstream media and the health and fitness world blame a single isolated factor to nutrition. Remember the sugar. Remember that fat was bad a few years ago. Then it was carbs, and now it's sugar, and now it's meat. It's like a never-ending revolving door, and the truth is, it's never as simple as this one weird factor that you need to remove from your diet. It's always a combination of things. All the references and all the studies that I mentioned in this video will be linked below, so click on those, read through them. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, let me know, and I'll see everyone next time.